good afternoon. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the Eucharist. We're going to be looking at the religious identity for contemporary communities. Going to be thinking about different terms. Let's get into it. Let's have a look at these learning objectives. So, the first one being to know what Christians mean by the term Eucharist. We're going to understand different interpretations of the form of the Eucharist, and we'll talk about that in lessons to come when we actually apply it into different kinds of different communities, denominations, that kind of stuff. And we're going to be able to discuss any similarities between these interpretations. So, are you ready? If I were you, I would have your notes out just like we were in class. It will really help you when you go back over and add to them, when you define terms and things. But let's start here. So I want you to first of all take a moment to write your own definition of what the Eucharist is. What is it? Some might call it something different, maybe Holy Communion or just communion, but what is it? So in your books, not in your books, in your whatever, journals, piece of paper, your folders, write your definition of what the Eucharist is. Pause me, and then we'll start again. Have you paused me? Have you? Okay, great. So by now you should have written your definition of what this thing is, the Eucharist. And then at the end of the lesson, we're going to come back to it and we're going to add to it. We're going to redraft your definition based on what you've understood throughout this lesson. So, first of all, Christians agree on this thing. Christians agree it's nearly universal practice for Christians to celebrate the Eucharist. They may call it by different names. So I don't know of any communities that don't celebrate the Eucharist, even if it's called something different or it might look very different. But most Christians agree that this is important. After all, Jesus said we should celebrate this thing. So most people do who call themselves Christians. So communion or the Last Supper or the Mass, the breaking of bread, but every week Christians around the world partake in this ritual meal. I've got a friend, we'll talk about this next lesson, but I've got a friend whose communion is simply a meal with friends, and they offer it back to God, to Jesus, in remembrance of him. We'll talk about that some more. We'll be looking at different interpretations of the significance of this event, but we begin by looking at the agreement by which it's such an important ritual in the life of the church. Why is it? Well, Paul talks to the Corinthians church and explains very simply. He describes this story. In 1 Corinthians 11, it says, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was given, betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" Okay. So Paul is obviously, well, not obviously, he's describing this event that happened, and we'll see later on. It's recorded in the Gospels as well. Luke 22 we'll look at in a bit. So he describes this new covenant. There's a difference he describes from the old way, the Old Testament process of atonement, and now, okay, what's happening here is fundamental, is so important to Christians to understand, to get into their heads what is happening, what does this represent. The Eucharist is a thanksgiving, it's a celebration of what Jesus did. And for Christians, they believe that his sacrifice means that complete forgiveness. This is massive. This is huge. So it's a celebration. It really is. So every time communion happens, although it might be for some a somber, very serious ritual, but actually it results in celebration. It really is that thing. So, you guys have looked at sacraments before. What is a sacrament? Okay, so we've said before how sacraments are symbols or rites that speak to Christians about the way that God saves. Okay, now this word sacrament, remember, is not in the New Testament anyway. It doesn't talk about sacraments in the early church. But Tertullian, he translated this Greek word mysterion into sacrament. He was trying to describe this mysterious way in which God saves humans. And therein really, I think, lies the problem of this thing. When we're looking at the Eucharist, we're talking about divine things, godly things, and we're trying to box it all in to a human understanding, and for us suddenly that's like missing bits, and it's a bit like this and it's a bit like that, but it's really hard to get a complete understanding when we're trying to understand the divine. Okay, so he was trying to Tertullian was trying to translate this word mysterion. He came up with this word sacrament. The term originally was used of Roman soldiers who affirmed an oath of loyalty. They used that word in that regard. This had a special meaning to a church who was being persecuted, and actually is really a very special meaning for the church today, which is around that oath, that understanding of absolute seriousness and commitment. Okay. So, on to my good friend Alistair. He's not actually my friend. I wish he was. A bit like N.T. Wright. I wish that we were friends, but that's okay. At some point he'll message me back. There we go. My cat might make an appearance. But here we go. So Alistair McGrath talks about, he's a superb New Testament scholar, Bible teacher, an apologist, a writer about C.S. Lewis, which in my book makes him absolutely amazing because his writing is incredible. But he talks about the Eucharist having these four different kind of elements, if you like. So the first one being recollection. Well, we remember, Christians remember what Jesus did, what happened at the cross, what was the sacrifice all about, and going through to what it meant. But what happened, and why was that so important? Anticipation is the second one. So celebrating this thing, the Eucharist, actually points us towards where we're going, the finalization of this thing. That's what Christians believe. That the Eucharist, there's that end point that it makes us think of. Then there's a reminder of the present, our individual faith. Well, what is this thing, the Eucharist? Why is that so important? And then there's the present as in community. So why am I doing this alongside my brother? What does that mean? What does that mean alongside my sister, kids, family? Okay, so there's this present understanding and reality that we are existing in when we celebrate this thing, the Eucharist. Okay, so it's literally an issue, though. Okay, well, we're going to find out in a moment. So the Eucharist, if you don't know, and everything in me thinks that you probably do because you've looked at this before, but the taking of bread and the drinking of some wine, or the taking of a wafer and drinking of some wine, or juice, or something to represent that, that is the thing of this ritual called the Eucharist. Okay, now I think it would be a good opportunity right now if we skip through to. So let's read this again. So 1 Corinthians 11, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. So Paul was talking to the community in Corinth. Remember, this is something that the Lord himself, God, passed on to me, and I'm passing it on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Eat some bread, eat in remembrance of what is about to happen. Remembrance of everything that I am about. Something that preachers would love to talk about, and I will not. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Okay, so let's get back to. So this is the point where Paul is explaining what the Eucharist is all about, but it's become literally an issue for some. So there's this moment where he said, "This is my body. This bread is my body." Oh, okay. What does that mean? But he also says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Or was that a metaphor? I'm not sure. So I want you to pause me now, and I want you to write down any questions that you have about this, or any questions that you have with the Eucharist in general. Pause. Okay, so hopefully you've written some good questions that actually you're going to answer when we get to the end, because no one else is there but you. Probably. So we are going to talk now about three different ways that Roman Catholics see this thing, Eucharist, or what they might call Mass. Okay, so the first one being this word transubstantiation, the second one being transsignification, and the third one transfinalization. Okay, so these words might sound like completely unobtainable, like you can't possibly understand it, it's too complicated. Hopefully you don't feel like that, but if you do, you don't need to. Don't worry, because they're split up and they all mean different things, and we'll break it down. So the first one of the most important ones, transubstantiation. So this word tran or trans, tran meaning across or to change. So we'll look at that as we get into it. So transubstantiation is the first of three. Okay, so Roman Catholics believe that this is literally his body and his blood. So when a priest prays and blesses the sacraments, they literally become part of his blood and his body. They believe that it's literally like the chemical structure of the bread changes. The chemical structure of the wine or the juice, whatever it is, changes, literally to his blood. Now, some people have problems with that. Some people who are Catholics have problems with it. Not all Catholics believe this. The Orthodox Church believes something very similar, but is different. So the Orthodox Church believes that there isn't blood. It doesn't actually turn into his body and his blood. It's just that there's significance in the meaning. Okay, so they believe in something they call trans-elementation or reordination. So the cup, the wine, and the bread is reordained as something different. There's a changing of the elements. This is significant. There is something divine going on, but it's not a chemical difference. Like the bread stays bread. That's what they believe. Orthodox Church. So, when it came to the kind of 16th century, and there were some serious issues with this, there was this thing, the Council of Trent, which I think you've talked about before. 1551, this idea of transubstantiation was challenged by Protestant Christians. But after some deep debate and scholarly work, it was reaffirmed as, yeah, this thing is correct. And they talked about the most wonderful conversion of bread into the body and the wine into the blood. It was reaffirmed. So I want you now to define in your writings, in your books, what is transubstantiation. So write that now. Pause me. Am I paused? Good. Okay, so hopefully now you've written your definition of transubstantiation. If you're not quite sure, you can go back and watch that bit again. So there are lots of key words. I've already said there are 3 Roman Catholic approaches, theories to this thing, the Eucharist, that we're going to be looking at, and then there's going to be 3 more Protestant Christian theories. Lots of key words. So now I would like you to start a spider diagram. I like colours. I like visual things. It helps me to understand. So start a spider diagram, a bit like this one. I mean, what a wonderful spider diagram. Those lines are excellent. To help you, just collate all your notes, collate these things. So by the end, you should have 6 topics, keywords on your spider diagram, which you can explain. It will help you in your revision. It will help you in your answering of essays. So the next one being Transsignification. Tongue twisters. Theory from Schillebeeckx. You've looked at him a lot. He talks about this thing being sacramentally, Jesus is present, but not literally. So he's one of those people that disagree. The DNA or the chemical structure of the bread and the wine doesn't change, but it's still something divine going on, still something really really significant for the believer. Okay, so here he also talks about a really interesting theory, which you might understand from being in lessons. Not my lessons, obviously, but this thing of presence. So you can be locally present, Schillebeeckx said, and personally, and they can switch around. What am I talking about? So you know the deal. Maybe you've been in a very boring lecture, maybe, where you have been in the room, but you've been thinking about something else. Maybe dinner that night, or the fact that your phone just went off and you're thinking about that. You're still in the room, so you're locally present, but you're not personally present. Okay, so Shilevik said that Jesus, in Holy Communion, in the Eucharist, in that ritual process, he is personally present, but he's not locally present. Okay, so he's personally present, not locally. So the DNA doesn't change, the chemical structure of the bread and the wine doesn't change. Okay, so the sacraments are first and foremost symbolic acts or activities as signs, he said. So there you go. There's a quote for you to use. Okay, transfinalization is the next one. So Karl Rahner, the German scholar, theologian, looked into this and he decided that the chemical structure doesn't change, but it stirs up faith in the believer in the mystery and the redemptive power of Jesus Christ. So he denied transubstantiation. So he said as well that the chemical structure of the bread and the wine doesn't change, but it's still hugely significant when it comes to thinking about what the end point is. What is the end point for all of this? For once you've taken it, once you've taken the Eucharist, well, the meaning of it becomes hugely significant, becomes real, becomes valid, a valid process. Transfinalization. Okay, so he said it's about not a physical change, but a spiritual activation or a spiritual nourishment that the Eucharist serves. So, we've talked so far about the Roman Catholic understanding of the Eucharist. So you should have now in your spider diagram transubstantiation, transignification, and transfinalization. So those three things, if I were you, I would make sure you put on there some detail about whether people who believe in this theory, say transubstantiation, believe that the bread and the wine actually change into his blood and his body. Great. So check back now, pause me again, and make sure you've got enough detail in there. So now we're going to be looking at the Protestant understanding of the Eucharist. So we're going to have 3 more circles on our spider diagram. Going to be looking at consubstantiation, memorialism, and virtualism. My spell checker obviously doesn't like those words. I need to add those in. So, consubstantiation is the first one. So this was brought up and brought about by Protestant scholars to challenge this Roman Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, as this morally and biblically this proves some problems. There are some issues with this, and so they put together this challenge to it. So they had consubstantiation, so the substance. So remember, the trans is changing it, and the con here, they talked about it coexisting. The spiritual reality of this thing is just as significant, but there's no literal change. It's a spiritual change. It coexists with this. Bread might be bread, the wine might be wine, but it coexists with a deeper spiritual meaning. Consubstantiation. So next one is memorialism. Okay, so here we can talk about Ulrich Zwingli, who we talked about before. He's already put the focus back on the Bible. That he talks about the sovereignty of God being hugely significant. It's not so much about the practices, he said. It's about how the bread and wine are regarded. So memorialism brings Jesus to mind. It brings to mind what actually happened when people take the communion. They ask questions like, "Well, what's he talking about? His body? It was broken. What? It's about remembering this event that happened, setting a memorial, if you like, memorialism." Zwingli said that's why the Eucharist is so significant. So, Luke 22:19. This is the story. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He says it's all about bringing Jesus back to mind. It's clear in Luke 22. So he says that the whole point of the Eucharist, this meal, however you celebrate it, you must do it to remember him and what he's done, what God's process evoked. So the last one is virtualism. Okay, now Calvin, although this isn't a Calvinist theory, don't get me started about that, but John Calvin said that there is power, deep, significant power in the bread and the wine. Denied that Jesus' blood and body are present because Jesus had ascended to heaven. So he said, how could he possibly be back in our Eucharist ritual when he's already gone to heaven? Good point. Good question. So in Acts 1 describes this story. You can check it out when Jesus literally ascended to heaven. So he said, well, that shows us that it can't possibly be this thing. This is virtualism. Sometimes it's known as receptionism. Lots of different isms. There we go. Okay. So at the beginning, you wrote down some questions that you have had about this, or any problems that you might have with the Eucharist. I'd like you now to pause me once more and go back and answer those questions if you can. If you can't, I would recommend you draft an email to either myself or Miss, and we will endeavour to get those answered for you. But try your best. Go back over, see if you can be a biblical scholar, and see if you can get to the bottom of what the answer is to your question. Go. Okay, so you should have answered your questions by now. 2 minutes I put on here. My goodness, I'm sure not, but well done for doing it. So your spider diagram should now be filled out. It should be filled with all these pros and cons, what makes sense to you, what the detail is of each one, which ones deny transubstantiation, that's the actual chemical structure change, as well as any other details that you've got to put in there, because that's really going to help. My scary emoji right there tells me that maybe some of you this is a nightmare, this isn't a helpful thing. So now I would like you to turn this into maybe a more helpful chart. So take that information and I want you to fill out a chart. It might look like this, covering all the transubstantiation, consubstantiation, transsignification, transfinalization, memorialism, and add in as well virtualism that we talked about. You could put a column Who believes it? Is this a Protestant or a Catholic theory? And what's the evidence for it? What's the evidence against it? Maybe a helpful column like, does this theory promote transubstantiation? That could be a thing. So try that now. So you can pause me and fill this in. Go. Okay, so that should be filled in. I'm sure it looks wonderful. It's very helpful, because when you go back and revise, this is really going to help you not only to remember, but to really structure in your minds how you're going to evaluate and analyze, as well as recall information. So now I want you to go back and look at the definition that you wrote at the beginning of what Eucharist is. So can you please go back now, have a look at that definition and redraft it, rewrite it. I bet that now you can write it with some more detail, with a more accurate perspective on what it looks like. So pause me and go rewrite that definition again. This one right here. Okay, so you should be back after writing another superb definition. So this practice essay, remember, you're going to write 2 answers in this particular exam, your assessment. When it comes to it, you're going to be writing the first one, AO1, which is going to be a statement which usually is about recall, it's about understanding, it's about your knowledge, being able to remember it. So you might be asked, explain why Christians practice the Eucharist. Okay, cool. So you can explain that by remembering what we've talked about, what you've studied. And AO2 will always be a statement, sometimes might be a bit controversial, that you then have to evaluate or analyze, synthesize understanding and have an opinion. So there needs to be a really good conclusion where you put in your own opinion, but you deliberate well, you explain why you would think this, you conclude and evaluate really brilliantly. That will get you the top marks. So you can choose now. I'd like you to do either AO1 or AO2 or even both. It's up to you. We got loads of time, right? So you can pause me and we can get into this. If you want, you can share it. You can share it with one another. I don't know what platforms you're using with all this, but feel free, share it with one another and see what each other think about it. Meanwhile, send it to Miss and she'll, I'm sure, give some feedback on it. But you get the experience and the practice of doing it. So today's lesson, what have we done? We've looked at the Eucharist. Our learning objectives for today were to know what Christians mean by the term Eucharist. We understand different interpretations of the form of the Eucharist, and we're able to discuss any similarities between these interpretations. So I hope that this has been really helpful for you to go through. It will be continued on next week when we recap some of this stuff, and we'll look at how is this practiced in contemporary conditions. So I hope that this has been helpful, and we will be in touch, I'm sure, and we'll see you soon. Bye.